I'm Daniel Schulof, a complete charlatan with a massive financial conflict of interest, and this is Dogs, Dog Food, and Dogma. In today's video, I'm going to provide an overview of the relevant scientific record concerning raw dog foods. These kinds of products are popular and quickly gaining popularity, and the evidence around them is not always very well understood. But it's actually quite straightforward and easy to summarize, at least I hope so. The first thing to understand about the science of raw dog food is a background point about that science. Remember, science is a tool that's used to reveal tough-to-see truth, but it's a tool that has to be wielded by human beings, and it's only as good as the people and the systems that are wielding it. And this is a really relevant consideration when it comes to this subject, because the veterinary nutritional science community has some very unique qualities that it doesn't share with most other scientific disciplines. The most important one is that there's very, very little funding available in it. At the time I published my book, the best available evidence was that only $16 million per year was spent on companion animal and equine nutrition combined, which is tiny. The massive sources of government funding that fuel all sorts of scientific research into human health topics just doesn't exist in the veterinary nutrition world. Which gets to the other important quality to note about the veterinary nutritional science community. What little funding there is essentially all comes from industry. The details of this are the subject of their own video, but in very general terms, essentially all the funding for companion animal research comes out of pet food companies and ingredient companies. And all the heavy hitters in this regard make cooked products, not raw ones. So what this all means is that there just isn't much research being done on the benefits of raw diets for dogs and cats. Something you hear over and over again when you talk to veterinarians about this issue is that there isn't evidence that raw diets do anything positive for dogs and cats. And that's true in a literal sense. But it's important not to confuse absence of evidence with evidence of absence. If raw diets were being studied with a serious interest in understanding them, this video would look very different. So, with all that being said, what does the scientific record actually say about the costs and benefits of raw diets for dogs? The first is that a raw all-meat diet is the most natural diet for a dog, unquestionably. As we've covered elsewhere in this series, there is unimpeachable evidence that raw meat is the only thing the domestic dog's ancestors ate for more than 99.9% of their evolution as a canine species. Over the very last fraction of their evolution, dogs also evolved the ability to digest starch. But if you believe that Darwinian evolution does a good job of telling us what's likely to be most healthful for a species, and spoiler, you should, then it's undeniable that a raw, all-meat diet is the most natural choice for a dog. The second thing you need to know about the science of raw diets is there's no meaningful evidence that they're associated with better health outcomes in dogs. But remember the important disclaimer from the beginning of our video. This stuff is criminally understudied. But nonetheless, at present, there are 0 studies showing better health outcomes in dogs fed raw diets, period. The third thing you need to know about the science of raw diets is there's also no evidence that raw diets provide dogs with any specific nutrients, enzymes, or any other constituent parts that cooked diets don't. Many proponents of raw diets have been making this argument for a long time, that something about cooking itself reduces the nutritioniness of ingredients. And again, that's not borne out in the research. That's a theory without meaningful empirical support. The fourth thing you need to know about the science of raw diets is that there is evidence that they can raise the risk of foodborne illnesses being transmitted to humans, but the risk is relatively insignificant. A host of studies have been performed that were aimed at understanding whether foodborne pathogens get passed from raw pet food products to pet owners. And more often than not, they find that there's at least some risk there. But there are 2 important things to note. Number 1, it's about people, not dogs. There's no meaningful evidence that commercially produced, complete and balanced raw pet food products raise the risk of foodborne illness in dogs. As you might expect, given their evolutionary history, dogs aren't very sensitive to the kinds of pathogens we typically see in raw meat. Number 2, the risk is pretty minor. At this point in time, there are millions of pets around the world being fed raw diets every day, and we're not seeing anything resembling widespread epidemics of foodborne pathogens. You adhere to common sense safety practices like refrigerating meat and disinfecting bowls after use, and that'll tend to eliminate all risk. None of what I've said to this point is really in serious dispute in the veterinary community. Disagreement over the costs and benefits of raw diets have much more to do with how to frame and how to weigh those costs and benefits than the actual disputes over the evidence itself. Most veterinarians are taught to look at the issues something like this. There's no evidence that raw diets are better for dogs, and there's some risk of foodborne illness. Something is better than nothing, so therefore raw diets are bad. I believe that's faulty reasoning. I think the way it should be framed is this. Raw, all-meat diets have been vetted for hundreds of millions of years by Mother Nature, and there's no evidence that kibble diets are any kind of improvement on them. So as long as you feel comfortable managing the minor risk of foodborne illness, you should defer to the judgment of Darwinian evolution, unless and until you've got evidence that you should feed kibble, not the other way around. One final point on the science of raw diets. Until really recently, raw diets were about the only way for pet owners to feed their animals a low carbohydrate diet. It was thought that in order to make kibble, you need to use carbohydrate. So if you want to eliminate the carbs, you need to go raw. And as I've explained elsewhere in this series, I'm obviously a big believer that there are plenty of good reasons to eliminate carbs. There are all sorts of ways that they do strange and unhealthy things to the canine body. So in that paradigm, there's evidence that feeding raw diets is healthier for dogs, but not because of the rawness, but because of the lack of carbohydrate. There are just two problems. First, that's no longer really the case. Plenty of commercially sold raw dog food products today contain loads of carbohydrate. They still charge prices as if they were all meat. So you can easily get hoodwinked into believing you're feeding a low carb diet simply by choosing a raw diet. But in reality, you're not. And the other problem is that all the veterinarians who have written literature reviews summarizing the costs and benefits of raw diets just completely ignore this point. They don't address the benefits of carbohydrate restriction, they just address the literal benefits of raw diets while ignoring the fact that they tend to be very low carbohydrate diets as well. And that's hugely disingenuous in my view. So, to summarize, what does the evidence say about raw, all-meat diets for dogs? Number one, it says that that's the most natural way to feed your dog. Number two, it says that there is no evidence of any correlation between feeding a raw diet and having any improved health outcomes in dogs. Three, it also says there's no evidence that feeding your dog a raw diet will provide it with any special nutrients that it can't get from eating a cooked diet. Four, there is some evidence that feeding a raw diet to your dog can increase the risk of transmission of foodborne pathogens to yourself and other human beings in your household. But the risk is kind of modest, and it's not something that you have to worry about for your dog, just about for yourself. And the fifth and final point about what the evidence surrounding raw diets says about your dog is that if your raw diet is also a carbohydrate restricted diet, as many, but not all of them are, then your dog will also enjoy the well-documented benefits of carbohydrate restriction for dogs. I'm Daniel Schulof, a complete charlatan with a massive financial conflict of interest. Thanks for watching.